Hello, good morning. Thank you. Welcome back from the coffee break. Nice to see you all here. And we move on with this second panel, second conversation we have today. The title of the session is Europe and the Global Peace Agenda. Myself, I've been for a long time a researcher working mostly on the post-Soviet space, on conflict in the region. And in this session, we're going to talk not so much, actually, not at all, about the post-Soviet space itself, but how the ongoing war in Europe had an impact on the rest of the world, on the capacity of the European Union to be an actor for peace in the rest of the world. So on many levels, we'll be talking about the fallout of the ongoing conflict and war on other world regions, and the capacity of the EU to work as an actor of peace at the global level. Think about how the EU can support peace building in other circumstances. And we'll look at the EU from other countries, from other world regions, and see how they look at the EU and what they expect, what they hope the EU would do to support peace efforts in their own contexts. So let's start our panel. I'll give the floor now to Donata Garrasi, Political and Security Strategy, former director at the UN with a long and impressive career working on peace and international affairs at the global level. So the floor is yours. As for the previous session, I'd expect you to talk for about 7-8 minutes, not longer. And I ask all of you to pay very much attention to the other speakers, because I would like to pick on one of the issues that you hear during the panel and comment on that later on. So thanks again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Buongiorno. Just a few reflections to begin with from the current situations that we're experiencing in the region, in Europe, with the Ukraine-Russia situation and where the EU stands there. Well, the implications and what's happening, we all know and read, and we heard a lot about it. But I'd like to point out three key outcomes of the current crisis that matters for where the EU is going. The first one is that we're realizing that the international institutions and international instruments for peace and security aren't working. They're not working, the global and regional ones. And the EU being a really important regional peace and security actor, besides an economic and political, in theory, actor. So that's number one. A crisis and a lack of capacity of these instruments to be effective in crises, including major crises that we are all witnessing and experiencing. Number one is that we're looking at polarized world, not in terms of bipolar, multipolar, but the fact that we're all focusing on the East and the West, the Russia and the China and the US and the EU somewhere in between. But actually, there are way many more countries out there that are, by their silence or by their silent support to one party or the other, influencing the way the international community is able or unable to play a positive role on peace and security. I'm thinking about many African countries where I used to work until a couple of years ago. India, Brazil, we all read the news, so we do know that the president of Brazil goes somewhere and insinuates support for one party and the other, but the bottom line is that there are huge groups of countries that are either not taking positions or are silently doing so, and in both cases, they are influencing the way the global agenda, peace and security agenda, is shaped. Right? Because when they go to the Security Council as non-permanent members, they vote in one way or the other. Often they do not vote. And same they do in the General Assembly when they are to express opinions about resolutions. And the third point is, that what's happening right now has demonstrated In my opinion, the big limitations of the way the European Union currently addresses conflict and security, peace and stability, and the big mismatch between the rhetoric and all the policies and instruments and funds and economic capacity and the reality, which is, oh my God, there's an invasion and then there's violence. What are we going to do? We're going to rearm, and we're going to invest much more money into our defense. And by defense, I mean hard defense. I don't mean soft defense. So I have worked for years and years on peace building, conflict prevention, and then in a few days it all becomes about military and common defense, which is needed, but it's part of the question. So what does that lead us? It leads us to a situation whereby I believe, and it sounds like a judgment and a negative judgment, but it's my personal experience. We're in a situation where we have a huge institution, that's the European Union, that's Europe, with huge capacities. The European Union invests our taxpayers' money, for those of us who pay taxes, because some don't because they work with the international organizations. Huge economic investment goes through the European Union in very many countries around the world. Huge presence. The European Union, through its delegations and different instruments, mechanisms, institutions, is present more or less everywhere in the world. Loads of, like I said, policies, strategies. I mean, I can't count them. I don't know if you guys know them all. I don't. Every year there's a new strategy that is developed, and it addresses one aspect of peace and security or the other. Ambassadors all over the place. And how does that translate into a capacity to have an impact and to influence conflict prevention, peace building, conduct a key role that the European Union could conduct in terms of mediation? It doesn't, in my opinion. And the more I traveled and the more I lived in Africa as elsewhere, Southeast Asia or Afghanistan, even in places like Colombia, the more you realize that there's a huge proliferation of initiatives by the European Union and its various funds and mechanisms at one level. So that's alone European Union. And then there are the states. That when the European Union, through the Commission or something else, says something, then you have President X and Z flying somewhere and giving different nuances to what has been the stance of the European Union as a union. So if you are at the receiving end of all of that, and for instance, me in conversation with some of my former country member partners in the Great Lakes region, you realize that on the one hand, the support and the message and the potential of the European Union, as for instance, an economic actor, soft power, is not fully realized. On the other hand, it can be exploited very ably by the spoilers, those who actually don't want things to get better. So one day they go and talk to Ambassador A of the European Union, and then the next day they go and talk to the manager of whatever fund. And so it's disaggregated, not in terms of being articulated at a local level, in terms of being too spread out and the European presence and the European intervention. And what, I'm going to have to look at my timing, and what does that mean? Well, that means that all this potential to have a positive impact, to play a mediation role, to help prevent conflict, crisis, solve conflict, is just not fulfilled. And therefore, we are missing on being able to play a major role in some of the small, local, subnational, and major regional and international crises. Where does that take us? And I'm going to use my last few seconds for that. Well, in my opinion, Europe and the European Union should go back to focusing on the soft power and the economic diplomacy capacity that the organization, the institution should have and should deploy, and they should maximize the amount of political capital and financing that they have available. One way of doing it is to really look at how to work on the economic piece, so how to attract investment and to rebuild the economics that needs to support peace in the medium and long term, and to back up the political peace effort, which sometimes is successful, often is not. And one way of doing that is to become a much more effective instrument to attract and vehicle private investment, the type of investment that come through the development finance institution, ABs. There are many, many, many different ones, but really to focus a little bit more on the famous SDG 16, but to look at the economics of what surrounds peace and conflict. I'm going to stop there, but I'd be happy to elaborate a little bit on this, how you invest in peace and how the European Union could play a better role at that, perhaps in the follow-up questions. Thank you.
Thank you for raising many substantive points, and in particular this dimension that we may think of, especially in this context of the EU as an actor engaging in peace initiatives focused explicitly on peace, but on many levels in many places of the world, the EU is thought perhaps primarily as an economic actor, and the influence that the EU as an economic actor can have on different situations of conflict is something that we should, of course, think very much about. I'll give the floor next to Hashim PONDEZA, who is AP Senior Advisor and Executive Director of the Center for Youth Dialogue in Zanzibar. I'll introduce the speakers as we go, but I should mention that, as you see, we have Sanna HARTY from the European External Action Service joining in the conversation, and looking forward to hear your thoughts a bit later. But now the floor goes to Hashim PONDEZA.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm very honored to be here, to be one of the speakers and contributing my ideas and my thoughts regarding the peace in Europe and beyond. I'll be speaking on three kind of main questions that will guide my presentation. The first question that the war in EU, specifically Russia and Ukraine, is impacting Global South or Africa in particular. And the second question that of looking at the EU, is it a relevant or championing kind of bloc in terms of peace? And the third question is that how can the EU support middle range or at the grassroots level kind of support to strengthening peace around the world? So coming to the first question, that the war in EU, particularly the war in Ukraine and Russia, is really to some extent, and is really impacting Global South and in particular in African countries. For instance, there is a high rise of food prices. Food prices has really gone up, and it's something maybe not really making sense for some of the developed countries to see the food prices can really impact social, political instances, but it is. We all know that all the unrest in Sudan started with just the price of bread, changing of the price of the bread. And you see what is going on in Sudan right now. And it's the same with the situation now in Kenya. We say it's because of the food prices, and all this kind is causing political instability, and also goes hand in hand with economic instability. And this is because grain is contributing huge kind of percentage of kind of food that we eat, and then Ukraine has been one of the bigger supplier of this thing, and with the war in Ukraine is a lot of impacting, and this changes prices of food, prices of fuel, all these kind of things are really impacting our economy, and when there's economic instability, a lot of economic hardship, and when youth, they don't get income generating activities, they usually become idle or become frustrated, and this opens the room for negative political narratives and also temptations to join kind of bad groups. And these are the situations that the groups like Al-Shabaab in East Africa are really utilizing in terms of recruiting youth based on frustration, economic frustrations. For instance, last year, in mid last year, more than 30 youth from Zanzibar disappeared, and the authority, they don't know where they went, but it's highly because from what they reported to their own families is that they went to join the extremist groups around the world. Some they went to Somalia, some they went to the ISIS in crossing the Djibouti and going to Yemen. So this is the global impact that, in a very summary, is applied to global South, like African countries. And has the EU still a peace champion at the global level? In my experience, and I think in my perspective, it is a very huge kind of contributor to the global peace in the world, and particularly in Africa. But we have to acknowledge that there's a high competition from other actors. We see right now there's a BRICS bloc, which is now believed to be the largest bloc in the world. It's contributing 31.5% of the economy, which is, it says the G7 is contributing 30%. So it's really growing up. And we also see that the Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa, they have plenty of waiting membership for countries to join them to become very, very great kind of bloc, and they have different kind of missions. If you, I had my sister-in-law travel to China last month, just before Eid holidays, and she couldn't use her credit card to use the USD. Because the China, they really don't allow use of US dollars. And this is very close to the EU, to the euros. So when you see there is impact to the utilization of USD, that is going closer to the utilization of euros. And recently, Kenya decided to buy oil from Saudi Arabia by using their own currencies instead of USD. And this really reflects what is happening, what is going to happen in terms of major blocks in the world. We see that there's a perceived truth that the current instability in Kenya has been contributed by BRICS, but also the Western, like US and the EU, fighting on the domination of the Kenyan kind of environment. But this is the same also. There's the BRICS, but also there's the EU and other countries. They want to have influence in Africa as a bloc, but sometimes as individual states. And all this has really impacting the African countries and the space that EU can work on. But still, EU is supporting the EEAS Center of PCVE Excellence in Djibouti. And we find that 150 billion euros that EU is investing in Africa to support infrastructure, to support social growth, but also security in African countries. And recently they added like 20 billion. All this really indicate the position of the EU to support the global peace, and particularly in Africa. I was in Nairobi in February, attended the International Humanitarian Peace and Support Center, and I saw some EU-supported countries who are supporting training to the AMISOM groups, and this is very showing that the EU is really supporting the peace in the world. And coming to the, based on the time, coming to my third question, how can the EU support the middle range and also the grassroots level? It's already happening in the world. For instance, in my country, in Tanzania, EU has supported the strengthening peace mechanisms in Zanzibar, whereby, the peace instability at the very small place, the island of Zanzibar, in particular in Tanzania, when there's peace instability, the recruiters, extremists, they are using the space to recruit youth, and then they become part of the Al-Shabaab fighters, and they make negative impact to Kenya and other places. So, I mean, the EU is really supporting the grassroots kind of strengthening peace. And right now, there's the Swahili Coast Project, which AP and other partners are working on to strengthen the capacities and linkages between youth and other peace stakeholders in Africa. Finally, I will say that violent extremism is a global problem, but only has local solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hashim, for the comments, for your thoughts, and for raising some important issues. Some go back again to that conversation about the EU as an economic actor and as the EU as a peace actor, and how the two dimensions are interlinked. And you also raised another big issue that has emerged more evidently in recent years, because I mean, the current war is, you know, as part the result and part as strengthened geopolitical tensions that were pre-existence, and they play out, unfortunately, very unfortunately, in Africa in different ways. So this is something we should also think about and consider when proposing a solution, both if they regard, you know, hard security issues or more long-term and grassroots investments that can really deal with, you know, bring peace in the long term and prevent issues such as violent extremism from emerging. Next, I'll give the floor to Huma SAEED, who is an AP member, MADRE consultant, has been doing a lot of work on Afghanistan, of course. So I'll give her the floor. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Good day, buongiorno. It's a pleasure to be here among the fantastic speakers. I would like to make my brief comments in basically in two capacities. One, as a researcher, long-term researcher of transitional justice, with focus on Afghanistan, and second, as someone who is from Afghanistan and among the few in this room who has also lived the war, although I've also been very fortunate from many perspectives. So as a researcher of transitional justice, and also referring specifically to the role that the EU has played in Afghanistan, not just the current role, but also the role that the EU and the international community, the huge role that the international community played in Afghanistan in the last 2 decades in the country. And EU was quite a significant actor in this period in Afghanistan. So I think the question we need whenever we talk about peace, in my view, we always have to talk about it in conjunction with justice. And justice, I mean, in this sense can be, yes, transitional justice if you're talking about countries that are coming out of conflict or some kind of dictatorship, where those societies need to reckon with their past, but also justice in the broader sense, because I think that peace without justice, without accountability, that can never be lasting in any country. And the research in many contexts has shown that. The experience of Afghanistan, what happened in the last 20 years, after the fall of the first Taliban regime in 2001, was that the international community intervened. They brought billions and billions of dollars to the country. But what they did, unfortunately, this was led by the United States, they empowered the warlords, those very warlords who had committed war crimes in Afghanistan. They were criminals. They needed to go on trial. Instead, they were empowered. They were brought back to power. In Afghanistan, in early 2000, that had a slight opportunity to walk a path towards transitional justice, maybe a country that has been in conflict now for 45 years, and a very difficult, complex conflict with periods of political transitions without transition justice. So I think in my research of transitional justice, Afghanistan by far is one of the most complicated countries, if not the most complicated country when it comes to dealing with the past and transitional justice. So there were some steps, baby steps taken, and I have to give credit there to the EU, because the EU was one of the more, especially the Netherlands, was one of the most active actors in that initiative. It was pushing actually towards that. But the US blocked that initiative because they said, well, we have to rely on these partners, the Mujahideen, you know, the very Mujahideen they had created during the war against the Soviets. So these guys, unfortunately, came back to power. This time they were involved in what I call economic state crime. That is, for example, corruption, land grabbing. I just published a book on this last year. And what happened to Afghanistan, and what was the reasoning behind that by these countries, the US and then they were also able to convince the European countries, was that, well, we have to prioritize security and peace, and not justice. We leave the justice, that's a kind of a luxury for now. But what happened, as it has happened everywhere else, is that at the end, Afghanistan had neither peace and security nor justice. And one of the reasons that the country collapsed, and the way it collapsed 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. So I really hope, both as somehow a practitioner, but also a scholar, that this will be a learning lesson for the EU and the world to not do this. And I think anybody dealing with peace needs to look at the elements of accountability. But accountability not just in the sense of criminal accountability. Of course, then there are also many different other aspects. I don't have now time to talk about it, but there's much research, including in my own work, about that. Like, you know, community reconciliation, for example. There are restorative justice initiatives that can be implemented. But specifically what I like to say, and here I like to talk now in my capacity as the Afghanistan advisor for MADRE, because we focus a lot on gender justice and focusing on gender persecution, that in the justice initiative, then I think there has to be a very significant focus on gender justice. What is happening today in Afghanistan, it is gender persecution. And gender persecution, as some may know in this room, it can amount to crime against humanity. That's also falling under the jurisdiction of the ICC, where Afghanistan is currently being investigated. As of last year, they started the open investigation in Afghanistan. And we at MADRE are working on this. And documentation, of course, there is very, very important. Documentation with the lens of gender persecution. Because unfortunately, despite the fact that crimes, sexual-based crimes, have always happened in all conflicts, they have hardly been adjudicated as such. So Afghanistan now is under the current Taliban regime, with what is happening in the country towards half of its population, we think is a quintessential case of gender persecution. But of course, this needs to be documented. This needs to be proved in the court of law. That is a different decision. But we are working towards that. And specifically about maybe two words about the more positive role of the EU that has played in Afghanistan, at least in the past. And then I also make a remark about the impact of the war in Ukraine. Just when Afghanistan was going through intra-Afghan peace negotiations in 2000, 2001, the EU started this peace support mechanism. And one of the initiatives it supported there were a couple of them, but one of them, which I found as one of the most tangible and maybe good examples, was supporting the National Victims Network. I mean, Afghanistan is a country where 70% of its population identify themselves direct or indirect, direct victims of war as a result of 45 years of war. So in that kind of country, it's extremely important to mobilize war victims. And for the first time, something like this happened, meaning that from the EU, at least a number of countries in the EU, there was a strong support towards this. And we know that the Netherlands has been one of those countries, always behind this. And then just a word about the impact of the war in Ukraine. Indeed, that has impacted also the role of the EU. EU still has its diplomatic representation in Afghanistan. I was just reading one piece on this that said that this researcher found out that there has been like 48% decline of EU aid in Afghanistan due to war in Ukraine, or as one of the factors. The other factor is also the internal dynamics of Afghanistan. As you know, no country at the moment recognizes Taliban, and that of course also has its impact. But for example, in 2021, EU had allocated 222 million euros, whereas that dropped in 2022, that dropped to 115 million. That's in the country. Outside the country, Afghanistan has a huge population that lives outside the country, like something like 6 million. Not all are registered. There are many now increasingly also in Europe, and that also significantly has impacted the asylum seeking cases. There are many stories that I don't have time to go to that, but certainly yes, the impact is there, and at the moment I don't know exactly what EU is doing on the ground. It has its presence, but I haven't really followed the specific cases. But I think it's important that it supports the local initiatives, and I think that is one of the issues that it continues to do. But one of the reasons we don't know that much anymore about is because many local actors, given the circumstances in Afghanistan, they are now keeping very, very low profile. So it's not like before where people would have their websites and you could go and get information. But we know that local civil society still exists. There are initiatives, the EU and UN, they are there somehow supporting, but there's not a lot of data and information. So we also don't have time anyway to talk about that. But I hope that even at this level, something continues in the country. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for your contribution. And starting from your last point, there's a lot of interesting points you raised, and this in particular is a challenge, I think, for governments around the world and for the EU in particular, perhaps. There is often this, habit of course, interacting with local governments in other world regions. And it is not so easy to work with grassroots organizations if there is not full consent from the government, or in some cases, if it doesn't actively go through some sort of vetting procedure from the government. So this is definitely a challenge from the perspective of the EU and other international actors and donors. But there's like another aspect you mentioned that I think that like to connect some of the dots between the previous, let's say, talks we heard. That, we've been talking about economic development, the security dimension, and now you brought our attention to justice. If you want, let's say, long-term peace, you need, all of these elements, and of course, like, justice must be very much part of this conversation. So thank you for mentioning both these aspects and the gender dimension, which is, again, we talk, in this context, we talk about it often in the context of like women, peace and security agenda and these kind of things, but there's, of course, much bigger issues that needs to be discussed. With this, I'll now give the floor to Sanna HARTY from the European External Action Service. So looking forward to hear more about the policies and practices of the EU in this context. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thank you for having me speak and participate in the conversation today in an online mode. I regret not being able to be there with you. Very interesting interventions already. Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed the reflections by Donata on the challenges the EU, including the EU, faces. Also the concrete positive examples of EU support by Hashim and Huma. Thank you very much for raising the challenging context of Afghanistan and the EU support there through the peace support mechanism, for example, and our continued presence. Indeed, maybe not the focus of our discussion today to go into the detail, but highlights how the EU makes efforts to engage in the most challenging contexts. I will start with the fact that it is clear that the EU's and the global security environment has deteriorated dramatically since the Russian invasion. The EU now faces a war at its doorstep that has the potential to further escalate, increasing the human cost and threatening the world's security architecture. So it's natural that citizens in Europe and beyond demand that the EU strengthen its geopolitical role as a global peace actor. This includes a need to reinforce its ability to be a security provider as well, and Donata has alluded to this, so I should mention that as well. In March, I'll focus a little bit on policy and strategy, of course, coming from the EEAS. So in March 2022, right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the EU and its member states took a huge step forward with the adoption of the strategic compass on security and defense. In the compass, they agreed to increase the EU's joint capacity and willingness to act, strengthen its resilience, to secure access to the strategic domains, and to invest in much needed capabilities, and to deepen strategic partnerships. And importantly, from the conflict prevention and mediation support angle that I work on, they also acknowledge that we need a more dynamic approach to conflict prevention and mediation to address the future challenges. And within this scope, the EU is working with a range of countries to address the root causes of conflict and instability through an integrated approach, which also includes the security in defense angles, which I won't go into more detail on. The Russian invasion dramatically changed the EU's outlook, prompting it to take unprecedented political decisions in a number of fields, as already mentioned, security, defense, sanctions, enlargement, and financial support. And the EU is delivering on all these with exceptional political unity. And of course, should mention that in the field of security and defense, the EU and its member states are collectively providing substantial support to Ukraine in many ways. But notwithstanding this support, the war will end like all wars do, with peace negotiations. Then we received some guiding questions beforehand. So is the EU still attractive as a peace champion? As you know, the EU was born as a peace project after World War II. It grew upon the conviction that cooperation between countries reduces the risk of violence. And this notion and commitment to peace building has been a reality in Europe ever since, and it has become a key element of the EU foreign policy and a core foreign policy interests as well. So preserving peace, preventing conflict, and strengthening international security are part of its core mandate. Moving on beyond Ukraine, while the war is raging there, numerous other violent conflicts continue or risk outbreak in different regions in our interconnected world, impacting more and more people's lives. And the EU is not forgetting the fragile parts, these other fragile parts of the world, and on the contrary, is paying increased attention to many other conflicts after the war in Ukraine. We will continue strengthening our role as a peace actor. And I look forward to the conversation later today because you might have notions on how we should do this best. I want to mention peace mediation as a key part of the EU's role as a global peace actor. We've enhanced our mediation profile, revised our policy, and expanded our internal capacity in this regard. This includes the establishment of an EU concept on peace mediation in 2020, the first ever EEAS peace mediation guidelines, which we are about to update. They're a public document online. And we also have a gender-balanced pool of EU mediators. And we engage in a range of mediation roles and have assumed a role in most national peace processes during the past decade. Going back a bit. And to mention some of the examples of high-level EU mediators, of course, the High Representative plays a particularly important role. And then the EU peace efforts are often led by EU High Representatives. The EU Special Representatives, EUSRs, of course. And in other regions, beyond those covered by the the Special Representatives, the EU offers discrete mediation support to key partners, be it the UN, EU member states, regional organizations like the African Union, or specialized civil society organizations. So in sum, the EU is already today a key mediation actor while increasingly becoming a geopolitical player as well. And then in terms of how can the EU support middle-range peace building and grassroots everyday peace efforts globally, when seeking peace, the EU focuses on two key aspects. First, how to better prepare for and prevent new violent conflicts. And secondly, how to mediate in existing conflicts to settle them. So this mediation angle I already touched upon. The increasing complexity of the geopolitical landscape leads to even more complex conflicts. And we work steadily to constantly reinforce our peace tool set to adapt to such emerging realities. For this, we engage consistently in conflict prevention efforts based on key principles and universal values, acting upon warning signs before tensions turn violent. So through tools such as early warning, horizon scanning, and conflict analysis, we aim at better understanding the reality in fragile and conflict-affected countries and regions to identify opportunities and tools for conflict prevention. We're uniquely placed. We can mobilize a complete set of tools, ranging from humanitarian aid to mediation, from training police forces and judges to institution building, from support to good governance to protection of human rights, from development aid to trade and investments, from disarmament to reconciliation, and from non-proliferation to empowerment of women and youth. So personally, this is the aspect that I found most fascinating when I work within the EU, because we are so unique in possessing this broad range of tools. Then in terms of the new challenges we're facing, the landscape of conflicts is changing, and we need to constantly adapt and keep developing our response. And we're constantly refining our approaches and tools and listening with a very careful ear to reflections like yours today on your views. We are taking these developments into consideration in our policy developments. I already mentioned some, and of course we do note that EU is not always perceived as completely neutral, as we're talking about the Ukraine war in Ukraine now. But by being transparent about foreign policy interests and defending universal values, and by increasing cooperation with partners, we are increasing our effectiveness and reach as a mediator. As an example, often through discrete contribution to peace. So I'll finish up there, but just to highlight 3 points at the end that I scribbled down as I was listening to Donata actually already. So first of all, policy and strategic foundation and member state ownership is very important for the EU. Secondly, we acknowledge the challenges and we address them the best we can. And thirdly, we make our best efforts to be as operational as possible in the current context. I finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanna, for raising again a number of issues of relevance to our conversation, of highlighting the role and the priority that the EU gives to its mediation capacities and efforts, as well as acknowledging the challenges, the geopolitical challenges. I mean, some of them are long-term, some of them have been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. So, to all of you in the public, that's the time to ask questions. I'll make a couple of brief comments, so you have a few more seconds to think your questions, so be ready to snap your hands up with your questions. I'll make a couple of short comments to our speakers, and then I'll give the floor to the conference participants. So in your, let's say, follow-up, I'd like you to focus on the, let's say, as like pragmatic dimensions, so make as specific and concrete examples as possible of the kind of things you've been talking about. So, for example, I mean, Donata Garazzi has been talking about, you know, these funding opportunities and investment. So how this should take place in practice. Hashim PONDEZA has talked about like some of these grassroots initiatives that have been taking place. You could make like some more examples of the kind of initiatives that EU and EU-based actors could, you know, have led or could implement to improve the situation on the ground with local partners, with local ownership. And Huma said, you talked about, you know, justice and gender issues, but there's now this big debate. How is it possible to implement and support grassroots initiatives as long as the Taliban are in power? So if you have some thoughts about this could take place, that would be very welcome. And to Hannah HARTY, you mentioned, I mean, made reference to these geopolitical challenges, but I think it would be interesting to know, like, if you have some examples or like some thoughts about how these challenges have emerged in practice, like in some specific situation, how they created like new difficulties for the EU, and how like there have been some perhaps attempts to deal with them, and you know, to raise these new challenges, or consider how the new geopolitical environment has actually created new conflict situation or new problematic situations in some conflict areas where the EU is active. So these are broadly, like, say, my inputs. So something pragmatic, perhaps that touches upon the impact of the war in Ukraine on the issues you mentioned. So how, the impact on that. And of course, if you have some point raised by other speakers during the previous talks, feel free to comment briefly on them. Please take your notes. If there are some questions from the audience, we'll pick them up. So I see them too. So first, here the gentleman. Please introduce yourself briefly and ask your question very briefly.
Hi, thank you. I'm Paul Grevet. I just graduated from SOAS, University of London. I have a question because I wrote my thesis on the peace process in Mali and the interventions from France, the EU, and the UN. And I sort of, in my research, came across the different missions of the EU, so training the Malian army forces, the Takuba task force, etc., and sort of the influence it had. And it was like the impression I had, it was that it was sort of moving towards from development to more of a security aim. And so that goes back to the triple nexus. And I was just wondering, is that, will that, because the term that I found was security traffic jam. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on this shift, and if you think it's a positive shift, and how that could compromise the role of the EU in championing peace, if it, you know, it has to tackle between security and just more like peace implementation as a economic peace, as you were mentioning, Donata. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sergio Strobans, and I work for the Institute for Economics and Peace. First, one info, Mrs. SAEED, we did not learn from the past. When we look at the 6 coup leaders from the 6 last coup d'etat in the Sahel in the past year, all 6 have been trained by US Special Forces. Somehow, we do not learn from the past. My main question is about the efficiency of what you have discussed. You spoke about this 150 billion invested by the EU in Africa. When I look at the reports we produce, I see that most of the LDCs are still in Africa. I see that the epicenter of the impact of terrorism is in sub-Saharan Africa, but concentrated in Sahel and the Horn of Africa. I see that most of the countries on the bottom of our peace indexes are African countries. So what is the return on investment? What is the efficiency of the investment of those 150 billion? And somehow the question is, how are these investments made worldwide, monitored and evaluated and re-injected within policy? And what is the real peace building strategy from the EU. Where do we want to go with peace building? How do we do it? How do we measure it? And how do we re-inject that into future policy? Thank you.
Sure. We had one more here, and then we'll give back the floor to
Thanks to all panelists, first of all, for your very interesting presentations. My name is Chiara Cervasio, and I work for a British NGO called BASIC, and we work in the field of nuclear diplomacy. So my question is mostly for Mrs. Garasi and Mrs. HARTY. And the question is, do you see a role for EU, for Europe in the field of nuclear diplomacy? What role, if any, should Europe have? And I mean both in like state-to-state diplomacy, but also in collaboration with the civil society, in like disarmament debates or nuclear risk reduction. Because with the increasing, I think, salience of nuclear weapons issues globally, with the NATO-Russia competition and US-China increasing divide and competition, I think that Europe should think about these issues.
Thank you. I think we'll give back the floor to the speakers. We'll have time for a second round of questions. So again, think about your questions. If you have them, be ready to snap up your hand. I'll give back the floor to the speakers in the same order that we talked earlier on. So first, the floor goes to Hashim.
Okay, thank you. I was hoping for a different order, but let's go. Let me start with Mali, actually. My view is that if we get to the point of a security traffic jam, as you described, it means that we have failed many other attempts to prevent conflict and to deliver peace. Hence, we're left with the hard security approach to it. And Mali and the Sahel, by the way, and Mali in particular, are great examples of how, over the years, the international community and the regional community, by the way, West African organizations and African Union, have completely underestimated the fragility of the country and of the region, and have kept on fueling, have kept on channeling funds, development funds. You're too young, but Mali once upon a time was the golden country when it came to good governance, good development. You know, when Liberia and Sierra Leone wars were going on, everybody was, oh my God, let's go and invest in Mali, let's go do things in Mali, they're so great. So there's an issue there with exactly what I was saying, which is we have not invested in peace, the different dimensions of peace, the economics of peace, the social peace, and etc. Now we're stuck with the security response. Sadly, when you get to that point, which is where Mali and the Sahel got to, I find it's really difficult to shift towards a more socioeconomic approach and soft security approach to supporting and promoting peace. Yeah, I don't know how that's going to end up, but I do think that was a big missed opportunity, and I don't know how the EU can fix that. We need a completely new look on Mali and on that region, which leads me to another point, which was a little bit the point our facilitator asked us to look at. And it's concrete examples. So I mentioned on and on these economics of peace. You know, it doesn't mean that nothing else is useful, but it does mean that if you're looking at phenomena like violent extremism, if you're looking at phenomena like food insecurity, if you're looking at ungoverned spaces, then you really need to think about the economics of it, what's behind. Why do we have food insecurity every 10 years or 5 years or all the time in regions that actually are either relatively fertile or could have efficient food systems. Why do you have food aid being flown into countries that could overproduce and even export? And one of the reasons why, I'm oversimplifying here, is that there isn't the right kind of investment in addressing the drivers of food insecurity, and it's more convenient for some actors to provide food aid and then beef up the humanitarian budgets, because actually even from a domestic political gain point, you can say, hey, we have supported huge humanitarian operation in country X and Z. So what does it mean to invest in peace? And we have here our colleague from the Institute of Economics and Peace. You basically didn't invent it, but put data and analysis and policy weight behind it. It means to invest in the drivers of peace. It means to bring the money to develop systems, money, investment, funds, to develop the systems that can produce and enhance social cohesion, that can reduce food insecurity, that can reduce the cost benefit of joining an extremist group, and so on and so forth. Let me stop here because no, there was an issue, a question addressed directly to us, the EU in diplomacy, civil society. Yeah, well, like I said, and I didn't want to. Well, I did sound critical of the EU, but then I come from the UN, so I'm used to that kind of criticism. The capacity of the EU to bring together its different instruments, as our colleague from the EU External Action Service said, there are many, is potentially huge. In my opinion, it's underutilized. So the EU could do much more. I don't have the answer, but working with civil society, for instance, is not what I'm used to. I haven't done enough of that, I think. But even that, you need to figure out an effective way of working with civil society where the EU becomes a vehicle for an effective partnership with civil society, but not just for the sake of it, because what I see is a lot of for the sake of it business. Yeah, let's bring in civil society and let's talk about arm reduction or whatever. So it's a different transaction, I think, that is needed. And I really don't have the answer. I'm going to think about it as the others speak, and maybe I'll have a better idea. Thanks.
Thanks again, progress to Hashim. I should remember that, of course, you can reply only to the questions that you feel you have some thoughts to give about. Perhaps one small addition, as I mentioned when I was talking about the pragmatic aspect that Sanna HARTY could talk about. I mentioned the geopolitical competition, but of course, pragmatic aspects of mediation would be just as relevant and interesting. So I should mention then. I give the floor to Hashim. There you go.
Thank you. I would like to respond on the 150 billion kind of investment and how that can be, how can the EU get it in return about it in terms of investing in African infrastructure, peace, and security. Well, this is very challenging question because of difference in priorities. I mean, different in definition of conflict, but also different of definition of peace. And individual states and the EU itself, they have different kind of definitions and priority in individual countries, particularly in Africa. For instance, a number of European countries and Western states, some of them, they don't believe that there is a relation between recruitment and radicalization of youth with regard to economic hardships. And this is something very important for the developing countries, LDCs. Economic hardship really makes them vulnerable and accepting kind of easily being taken into extremist groups. So there's different in kind of priorities that really leads into kind of misunderstanding or misimplementation of the strategies and plans that the EU has agreed with individual states. And there's a political different in political interest, We have like African Union with more than 50 member states, but some of the member states, they are in blocks like West and East. And within the East, some of them, they are really not relating or really supporting each other. And some of this investment are really for the entire bloc, like East Africa. But you find that relations between DRC and Rwanda is different, you know, as compared to Burundi and Uganda and Tanzania. So all this really impact kind of implementation and pace of return in terms of peace and economic development in Africa. And then the last thing that I'll mention here is that the existence of BRICS, which is not really spoken in the context of Africa or in Tanzania, but is really working like under the sea. I mean, they say that when you look the ocean, you find water is really stable, steady, but there's a lot of lives under it. So BRICS is really working hard to have the influence in Africa. But then you find individual states like Russia individually outside of the BRIC is really working hard to really disrupt what is supported by the EU and the US and other developing countries. But also Russia is doing the same. We find that now countries like Uganda, what is believing, what is making statements, what is happening in Kenya and other African countries has some extent of influence from the individual states, Russia and China, but also in the US. And you really need to have an example of leadership that really they define their existence and what they want to do. Like for instance, the country of Rwanda, you have Paul Kagame, is really revitalizing the green energy, but also investment is coming up. This is because of the decisions is not providing room for the influence from different parts rather than making decisions on what is important to his country. And this is make space for the country to really make their own decisions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I will start with some pragmatic examples that you were asking us. With regard to Afghanistan in the current situation, it is very difficult for international actors to operate. I don't know if you have followed some of these latest developments with the Taliban imposing all the restrictions, including the latest being on the UN local female employees. And that really sparked many discussions among the UN with very confusing messages. So the next day, some UN agency, including the head of UNDP, announced that, you know, we will not work in Afghanistan under these conditions. But then the UNDP country representative came and said, we're not leaving this country. So it's not clear what is happening. I mean, the UNAMA or others, they declare that, well, the UNAMA really has not declared the either or position, and some experts believe that they are not going to leave. The UN is not going to leave Afghanistan, but there have been other comments like, you know, if this would be compromising our principles, so we're leaving. While this is being stated, another statement comes from the Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Amina Mohammad, saying, we're going to hold this meeting in Doha with the Taliban that just took place yesterday and the day before, and we're initiating against those baby steps towards the recognition of the Taliban. So for many Afghans, especially the activists, it is very confusing what is happening within the UN. Like, is there really not a coherence in the organization when it comes to such situations? And Afghanistan perhaps does present one of the most challenging situations to the UN. I haven't heard similar discussions about the EU. As I said, the EU has a diplomatic presence in Afghanistan. Somehow it is, maybe it's me, I don't follow it that closely, but it's also possible that the EU has found a way where it can operate without these kind of issues. For example, I haven't heard that the EU local female staffs cannot work anymore. And also, as I said before, because many organizations who were grassroots organizations, civil society organizations who were supported, receiving support from like EU or other international organizations, they've left the country. So for the first, at least a year or first months, there was this vacuum. Even I think international organizations, they didn't know their projects undergoing. But then the staff of these organizations, they left during that huge evacuation 2 years ago. But then now there are other emerging civil society organizations, or some decided to stay in the country, including some very courageous women. They have reformed their activities, but they have decided to stay in the country. But I have not been able to follow very specifically how the EU continues its support towards these very grassroots organizations. As an example, I'm assuming there is this organization called PenPath that has been working in the field of education. Very unfortunately, about a month ago, the person, the director of this organization, a guy named Namatullah Visa, who has been traveling Afghanistan, all over, Afghanistan villages, championing women's, girls' education, including the Taliban. He has been arrested by the Taliban. He's in detention. We don't have any idea what is happening. But I have, for example, seen his photos with the EU officials in Afghanistan. It's possible he was receiving clearly some support from the EU. So I think it is my guess that the EU is supporting maybe such local initiatives that do exist. But at the same time, they want to keep very low profile. Everybody in Afghanistan now wants to keep very low profile, at least, the local organizations, because I know under the Taliban, of course, it's very, very difficult to operate, and they have to be very creative. Whereas in diaspora community, they're going very vocal, many women included. But I think, the EU is still, they're already providing some support to home-based schooling and initiatives, because that's also something that is happening. And it needs to happen. It must continue. There's huge demand from the country for all these girls, millions of girls who are who cannot attend school or universities anymore. There are initiatives, and I do hope that an organization like the EU would support these initiatives. Documentation, for example, we know that there are initiatives in the country towards documentation in support with the organizations outside Afghanistan. And this is actually one of the areas where I also work. But it's very challenging. As you can imagine, in documentation and the current situation in Afghanistan is very, very challenging. It's taking place, but it's definitely an area that it needs support. Maybe quickly on the strategies on peace building, I think, this is a huge question, obviously. But I think it depends, what are the approaches towards peace building. As we know, there are already academics who have written with very critical approaches, especially towards liberal peace building, being very top-down. So I think those are some very valid points. But peace building in these countries definitely have their internal dimension, they have their external dimension. And both are very important, but I think that if you want peace building initiatives, and I say this also from the experience, not just from some articles that I've read, if you want peace building initiatives to be sustainable, to be successful, we really need to put the locals in the driving seat. The agency, the question of agency of locals, with that decision-making capacity, with the capacity to prioritize based on their needs, that is extremely important. This, unfortunately, it doesn't happen. The opposite may happen, because there is always this tension also between the local and the external. But I think that is extremely important. And some other issues, justice, in my view, it has to be an integral part of any peace building initiative, as well as addressing structural issues. Again, experience has shown, and there are many articles about it as well, that as long as the structural issues in countries are not addressed, and then, of course, it depends what those are. Some countries, maybe it's around land disputes or ethnic divisions. Sporadic initiatives here and there is not going to radically transform a society.
Thank you. Sanna, HARTY.
Thank you very much. Many of the questions were already answered. I'll start with the geopolitical challenges for the EU, sort of from a concrete examples perspective. I think this was already mentioned that, for example, some countries in Africa have not seen the Russian invasion as we do, as a Russian unilateral, unprovoked invasion in the Ukraine. And these countries are our partner countries. We're partnering with them on peace building efforts. So this, of course, adds a complexity to our work with them and in these contexts. Then, secondly, how do we go about peace building? How do we measure it? Huma was just discussing it there. I think, of course, I've mentioned the policies. Policies and strategies from the EU side, of course, it's always conflict specific. So we base our engagement on a careful conflict analysis. And we have strategies depending on the different contexts. I find this question of how do we measure it very, very interesting, and it links with the risks and risk awareness and risk tolerance of peace building efforts, which are oftentimes long-term investments and challenging to measure the successes, and the contexts also change and the situation fluctuates. So loads of challenges there. There was the question on the EU role in nuclear diplomacy, and I'll connect that. I'll bridge with that to concrete examples on EU mediation, which also were asked by the chair. I want to highlight the role of the High Representative as he led the negotiations in Vienna with regard to the Iran nuclear talks and facilitated the proximity talks between Iran and the US. And maybe to give a couple of other examples from the work of the special representatives, a good one is the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, where the EUSR for the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, LICHAC, has taken forward the EU-facilitated dialogue aiming at comprehensive normalization of relations. And in the South Caucasus, EUSR Tovaklar has been instrumental in ensuring that the EU remains a credible and constructive actor in contributing to the prevention and peaceful settlement of conflicts in the region. And then furthermore, the USR for the Horn of Africa, Annette Weber, has been engaging with partners to support the implementation of the agreement on the cessation of hostilities in northern Ethiopia, and to make steps towards peace and reconciliation in the country. We're also working on transitional justice, as Huma was highlighting before in Ethiopia. So just to give a couple of examples, and these are, of course, higher level examples. Beyond that, for example, we're working to support insider mediation. Local mediators, sometimes an external mediator is not as accepted, welcome. And it makes much more sense to support the local peace building networks in countries. So the EU is putting a lot of emphasis also on supporting insider mediation. Maybe in the interest of time, I have to stop there, but thank you very much for the very interesting questions and conversation.
Thank you for paying attention to the time dimension, which is really tricky because time is ticking. It's almost 1 p.m. I promise there will be a second round. So if you have very short comments, I think now is the time to take them, but really please be short, and then we're ready to close the session. So if there's brief questions or shorts, see one here and then one there, and then probably we'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot. That's very extremely interesting and timing discussion. When I think to the EU peace mediation, conflict prevention instruments, it's something that I really have been focused in the last years. I think most of them are there, and all the wording and the concept that we really like are there. So gender mainstreaming, mediation, civil societies, and so on. But what we elaborated in the last years, and it was also part of last year's discussion at the forum when we touch up on conflict prevention, was that the technical side, the more instrument, are a little bit disconnected from the political one. And that's something that I want to ask you from your different perspective, more Brussels EEAS based, and for the different country. So we see, if I really read through the mediation guidelines, they are, I mean, they are great. I mean, everything is there. Also climate change, the psychological dimension, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to political decision, in some case, I mean, there is some kind of connection, but I really have the impression, also discussed with colleagues at the EEAS, that, I mean, the analysis, also the conflict, and the politicians, and from Borrell and high level in the States when they act at the EU, they really don't through the analysis, the conflict analysis, and so on. Thank you.
Last question.
Thank you very much. My question, from what it emerges from the presentations, it looks like the EU is operating as one among other actors in complex theaters where security challenges need to be addressed from different perspectives. And one of these perspectives is governance. Besides economic factors, bad governance can operate as a driver, even of dynamics of radicalization. And so the EU is operating as one among other actors. And my question is, how can the EU increase its legitimacy and credibility in contexts where other actors seek to operate as more appealing security partners, and so tackle problems related to governance? Thanks.
Thank you. Like 1 minute answer for those of you who want to take this up. I think Sanna, probably we start from her.
Thanks very much. I'll try to be very, very short. So the first question, technical side, disconnected from the policy. I feel the contrary from my work personally. So we work very closely with foreign policy instruments and INSPA as well in the implementation and operationalization of the concept. So we work hand in hand. Insider mediation is a good example where we work closely with FPI and UNDP as well. I'm not saying that there isn't work to be done there, but just to give some positive examples, conflict analysis screenings are implemented together between our division and INSPA, or facilitated, of course, always in the leadership of the under the leadership of the delegations, and then working in contexts where other competing actors. How can the EU increase our role? I think here the key is the utilization of the tools, the broad tool set that we have, which has been highlighted before. Donata was mentioning that there is capacity. There would be more capacity than how the EU is implementing it at the moment. So I think the answer lies there. Good mobilization of the broad package of tools.
Thank you. If you have very short comments here, or so I think thank you again for being here, for being patient, for letting us talk for a couple of minutes longer than initially planned. Now it's good, perfect time for lunch. So there you go.
Thank you so much.